Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but in my family, it just means they know exactly where to slip the knife before you even realize you are bleeding. My name is Arthur. I am 68 years old, a retired carpenter, and until a few months ago, I lived a quiet, solitary life in a modest farmhouse that I built with my own 2 hands. My wife, Mary, passed away 12 years ago, leaving me with a profound silence that I eventually learned to fill with routine and hard work. I never cared for flashy cars, expensive vacations, or designer labels. I wore the same leather work boots until the soles gave out completely, and I grew most of my own vegetables in the backyard garden. To the outside world, and especially to my estranged, status-obsessed family, I was just a stubborn, bitter old miser quietly fading away on a fixed pension. But people only see what you let them see. They had no idea that my worn-out flannel shirts and patched jeans were a carefully maintained illusion. For over 35 years, I took every extra dollar I earned from my carpentry business and quietly converted it into something tangible, something real. Deep down in my cellar, hidden beneath a false floorboard, I crafted myself. Sat a massive, fireproof steel safe. Inside that safe was my true life's work, a retirement fund consisting of solid, heavy gold bars. I trusted gold. I did not trust banks, and I certainly did not trust the people I shared a bloodline with. I planned to use it to secure my final years. Perhaps leave a quiet donation to the local children's hospital that cared for Mary during her final days. Those plans, however, were about to be violently derailed by my own flesh and blood. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October. I was up on an aluminum ladder, clearing wet leaves from the gutters, a chore I had done 100 times before without a second thought. One moment I was reaching for a stubborn clump of pine needles, and the next, the ladder shifted in the damp mud. The ground rushed up to meet me with terrifying speed. The sickening crack echoed in the quiet yard before the pain even registered in my brain. I had shattered my right leg in 2 different places, lying there in the cold, wet grass, unable to move and waiting for the ambulance. I realized how incredibly fragile my independence truly was. The hospital stay was a blur of agonizing surgeries, metal pins, and sterile white lights. When the doctors told me I would be completely non-weight-bearing for at least 8 weeks, the grim reality of my situation set in. The hospital's social worker made it abundantly clear that I could not go back to my isolated farmhouse alone. I needed a full-time caregiver. Enter my younger sister, Brenda, and her 32-year-old son, Derek. I had not spoken to Brenda in almost 5 years. Not since she tried to aggressively guilt me into co-signing a massive loan for Derek's latest failed business venture. Yet, the moment she heard about my accident, she swooped into my hospital room with wide, tearful eyes. She clutched my hand, putting on a grand performance for the nursing staff, swearing that family takes care of family no matter what. I was exhausted, heavily medicated, and desperate to go home to my own bed. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I let them in. I thought it was a rare moment of familial duty, but I should have recognized the familiar, hungry glint in Derek's eyes. A quiet, predatory calculation that meant my nightmare was only just beginning. The day they brought me home, the dynamic shifted immediately. They did not come to care for me. They came to occupy my space. Brenda hauled in 3 massive suitcases, taking over the master bedroom, my sacred sanctuary with Mary, without even bothering to ask my permission. Derek tossed his bags into the guest room and immediately began complaining about the sluggish internet speed and the lack of premium television channels. I was confined to a makeshift bed on the living room couch on the 1st floor, trapped in a heavy plaster cast and a dense haze of prescription painkillers. The physical pain was a constant, throbbing companion. But it was the sheer indignity that truly began to break my spirit. I had always been a man of action. If a pipe leaked, I fixed it. If the roof needed patching, I climbed up and did it. Now, simply getting a glass of water required me to ring a small brass bell Brenda had sarcastically left on the coffee table. Most of the time, she completely ignored it. I would lie there for hours, my throat parched, listening to the blare of reality television coming from my own television set, while she and Derek laughed at something in the kitchen. Within 48 hours, my quiet, peaceful farmhouse was transformed into a chaotic, noisy hostel. Brenda and Derek treated my home like an all-inclusive resort where they were the VIP guests and I was the bothersome, disabled staff. When I handed Brenda my emergency credit card, it was with strict instructions to buy basic provisions like rice, chicken, and some fresh vegetables. A week later, my phone buzzed with an alert from the bank. She had spent over $400 at a gourmet grocery store across town, followed by a $200 charge at a high-end liquor store. When I confronted her about the charges, she rolled her eyes, crossed her arms, and told me that caregiving was highly stressful and she deserved a little comfort while dealing with my constant demands. I had asked for a fresh ice pack twice that entire day. They emptied my pantry of the preserves I had canned myself, throwing the jars in the trash to make room for expensive imported cheeses and imported beers. The house constantly smelled of stale cigarette smoke, a habit Derek refused to take outside despite my chronic coughing. They did not just disrespect my home. They actively mocked my entire existence right to my face. One evening, Derek stood in the living room, casually eating an apple he had not bothered to wash. Staring down at me on the couch, he sneered at my worn-out furniture and the lack of modern, expensive gadgets. He told me it was pathetic that a man who worked his whole life had absolutely nothing to show for it but a dusty old house and a broken leg. Brenda chimed in from the hallway, laughing loudly. She called me the definition of a cautionary tale, a man who worked himself to the bone just to die broke, miserable, and alone. I bit my tongue, staring blankly at the ceiling, feeling a cold, heavy knot of anger forming deep in my chest. They thought I was a helpless, penniless old fool. They thought they held all the power in this house. They had no idea what was resting beneath the very floorboards they were walking on. But I knew their arrogant, boundless greed would soon lead them straight toward it. The hardest part of being trapped inside your own failing body is not the physical agony, but the creeping realization that the predators pacing the hallways already consider you a helpless corpse. My world had shrunk to the four corners of the floral living room rug, anchored to the couch by a heavy plaster cast and a dull, constant throb in my shattered leg. I was stripped of my autonomy. In the daylight, Brenda and Derek ignored me, absorbed in their television shows and expensive snacks purchased on my dime. But it was the nighttime that truly began to wear down my sanity. For over 4 decades, I knew every groan and whisper of my farmhouse. I knew the wind rattling the loose pane in the kitchen, and I knew the sharp crack the foundation made when the temperature dropped below freezing. Now, an entirely new set of sounds echoed through the dark, and they belonged to my nephew. Night after night, long after Brenda had retired to my master bedroom, I would lie awake in the suffocating blackness of the living room, listening. Heavy footsteps would descend the staircase. Derek never turned on the lights. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man searching for something he felt he was owed. He paced the hallways, his sneakers squeaking softly against the original hardwood floors. I would hold my breath, pretending to be asleep as his shadow lingered in the archway of the living room, watching me. He was hunting for a paper trail, utterly blind to the fact that the actual fortune he was looking for required an entirely different kind of digging. My physical confinement meant I could do nothing to stop his nocturnal expeditions, but I was far from oblivious. One Tuesday afternoon, while Brenda and Derek drove into town to waste more of my money at a fancy bistro, I grabbed my aluminum crutches. The effort to haul myself upright sent sharp bolts of fire up my thigh, but the stinging anger in my gut propelled me forward. I swung my way down the short hall to my private office. It was a small, dusty room packed with filing cabinets, old blueprints, and my heavy oak desk. I only needed a quick glance to see the violation. I am a carpenter. I measure my life in fractions of an inch, and I notice when things are out of square. The stack of past-due water bills I kept on the corner of the desk had been shifted roughly 2 inches to the left. The leather-bound ledger containing my mundane household expenses was slightly askew. But the most damning evidence was the brass lock on the top right drawer of the desk. Deep, fresh scratches scarred the metal, gleaming brightly against the tarnished brass. Someone had taken a flathead screwdriver to it, trying to pry it open without fully breaking the mechanism. They failed, but the intent was loud and clear. Derek was actively searching for my assets. The emotional toll of becoming prey in my own sanctuary began to weigh on me like a suffocating blanket. This house was the only place in the world where I felt safe since Mary died. Now, I was forced to watch every word I said, analyzing every glance Brenda and Derek exchanged across the kitchen island. I wanted to scream at them, to demand they pack their bags and get off my property. But what could a crippled, 68-year-old man do against a healthy 32-year-old and a spiteful sister who controlled my access to food, water, and pain medication? I had to swallow my pride and choke down the bile rising in my throat. The physical snooping soon evolved into verbal probing. The very next morning, Derek sauntered into the living room holding a lukewarm mug of instant coffee. He dropped himself into the armchair across from my makeshift bed, crossing his ankle over his knee. He wore a sickeningly sweet smile that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He asked how I was feeling, a hollow pleasantry, before casually steering the conversation toward his actual agenda. He mentioned how fragile life was, how my fall from the ladder was a huge wake-up call for the whole family. Then, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He asked if I had a guy who handled my life insurance, or if my bank accounts were properly structured to avoid probate. He claimed he was just trying to make sure I was taken care of. Uncle Artie, just looking out for the family estate in case something terrible happened. The audacity of the boy was staggering. He was sitting in my house, drinking my coffee, actively trying to inventory my wealth to see if my death would be a profitable venture for him. I kept my face perfectly slack. I let my hands tremble just a fraction more than usual, putting on the mask of an ignorant, frail old man overwhelmed by the complexities of the modern world. I told him in a reedy, exhausted voice that the local credit union handled my meager pension, and that I had let my life insurance lapse years ago because I simply could not afford the premiums. I told him the house was all I had left, and even that was becoming too expensive to heat in the winter. Derek leaned back, a flicker of genuine disappointment crossing his face. But then he recovered, his eyes darting toward the hallway leading to my office. He did not believe me. He knew there had to be more, and his greed was a bottomless pit that would never be satisfied by a simple denial. Brenda walked in a moment later, carrying a glossy magazine she had bought with my funds, and the two of them exchanged a loaded, secretive look that made the hair on my arms stand up. They thought they were so incredibly clever. They believed they were playing a high-stakes game of chess against a senile opponent who did not even know the rules. But letting them believe the lion was toothless and blind was exactly what I needed to ensure they stepped cleanly into the jaws of the retribution I was already designing. I closed my eyes, feigning sleep, while my mind raced with blueprints, measurements, and the cold, hard mathematics of outsmarting the people who thought I was already buried. The fragile piece of my own home was about to shatter completely, cracked wide open by a single, careless mistake that would cost my family everything. From the very first day I bought the farmhouse 40 years ago, I established one absolute, unbreakable rule with anyone who visited. The cellar was strictly off limits. I always spun a convincing tale about black mold, rotting support beams, and dangerously exposed wiring that made it a severe hazard to navigate. It was a lie born of pure necessity, a shield designed to protect the hidden sanctuary where I poured decades of blood, sweat, and calloused labor. The heavy oak door in the kitchen leading down to the darkness was usually secured by a thick brass padlock, but in the frantic, terrifying chaos of my ambulance ride, I had left it unlatched. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The sky outside the living room windows was a bruised, heavy purple, and the rain lashed aggressively against the glass. Brenda suddenly decided it was time to play the role of the doting, fiercely dedicated sister. She bustled into the living room carrying a plastic basin of warm water, a stack of thick cotton towels, and a bottle of expensive shampoo she had purchased using my credit card. She insisted on washing my hair right there on the couch, elevating my head with pillows and keeping me completely immobilized. She was overly chatty, speaking in a loud, boisterous voice that aggressively filled the room, designed to drown out the ambient sounds of the old house, but my ears were finely tuned to the specific frequencies of my home. Beneath her sudden, loud recounting of a luxury cruise she took 10 years ago, I heard the distinct, agonizingly slow creak of the cellar door hinges opening in the kitchen. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, sending a flush of heat up my neck. Derek was making his move. Brenda scrubbed my scalp with a rough, distracting vigor, her booming voice acting as the perfect auditory cover for her son. Down below, Derek was prowling through the damp, cool air of the basement. I closed my eyes, letting the warm water run over my scalp, mapping his exact location in my mind based on the subtle, heavy vibrations traveling up through the floor joists. He was moving past the old oil furnace. He was walking toward the back right corner. He was standing directly over the false floorboard I had meticulously crafted out of aged pine to blend seamlessly with the surrounding concrete and wood. I knew the precise weight of the steel safe door hidden down there. But what Derek did not realize was that finding the box was only the first, fatal step into a trap I was already beginning to weave. The grooming session lasted nearly an hour, just long enough for Derek to conduct a thorough, uninterrupted search of my most private domain. When Brenda finally finished and marched to the kitchen to dump the dirty basin water, Derek miraculously appeared from the hallway. His clothes were dusted with a faint layer of basement cobwebs, his hair slightly damp from the humidity of the cellar, and his eyes were wide, practically vibrating with an electric, greedy energy. He avoided my gaze completely, staring at the television screen without actually seeing the picture. Later that evening, after the two of them had retreated to their respective corners of the house, I needed to make my painful, exhausting trek to the ground floor half bathroom. I hauled myself up onto my aluminum crutches, the broken bones in my leg throbbing with a dull, sickening heat that made my vision blur at the edges. As I swung my heavy body through the darkened kitchen, a glint of metallic light caught my eye. The cellar door was shut tight, but sitting right on the small wooden workbench positioned just inches from the top of the stairs was a heavy, military-grade black flashlight. It was absolutely not mine. I owned a cheap yellow plastic lantern that I kept safely on the pantry shelf. Derek had carelessly left his primary tool behind in his sheer, overwhelming excitement. He had breached my sanctuary, and he was too drunk on the thrill of discovery to cover his tracks properly. The true, horrifying depth of their betrayal, however, was not fully revealed to me until the dead of night. It was around 2 a.m. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the farmhouse wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence. I was lying rigidly on my back on the couch, staring blindly at the shadowed ceiling, my mind racing with 100 different worst-case scenarios. Then, the faint hiss of whispered voices drifted down the stairs from the kitchen. Brenda and Derek had crept out of their comfortable beds to convene in the dark like thieves. I slowly, agonizingly rolled onto my side, ignoring the sharp spike of pain radiating up my shattered thigh, and strained every nerve to listen. "I am telling you, Mom, it is massive," Derek hissed, his voice trembling with unchecked adrenaline and raw greed. "It is a heavy-duty, commercial-grade combination safe. It is bolted directly into the foundation, right under a fake floorboard. The old man is a complete fraud." Brenda let out a sharp, breathless gasp. "Are you absolutely sure? Derek, a safe?" "Why would a broke, miserable carpenter need a safe that size down there?" "Because he is not broke," Derek fired back, pacing a tight, restless circle on the linoleum floor. "Think about it. He never took vacations. He drove that rusty truck for 20 years. He paid off this house decades ago. He has been hoarding cash down there. Or bearer bonds. Or precious metals. He is sitting on an absolute gold mine, and he is just going to let it rot in the dirt while we are struggling to survive out in the real world. The sheer entitlement dripping from his words made my blood run ice cold in my veins. They were not struggling to survive. They were drowning in crippling debts born of their own laziness, terrible investments, and endless vanity. Listening to their greedy fantasies, I realized they were entirely predictable, and that very predictability would become the ultimate weapon in my arsenal. "We need to get into it," Brenda whispered, her voice suddenly taking on a hard, ugly edge that I had not heard since we were bickering teenagers. "He owes us for all the stress he has put the family through over the years. He owes us for dropping our lives and taking care of him right now." "I tried the handle," Derek replied bitterly, his frustration echoing softly in the dark kitchen. "It is solid steel. We need the combination, or we need a serious way to cut through it. But we have to be smart about this. If he knows we found it, he will try to move it." "He cannot move," Brenda scoffed coldly, the utter contempt in her tone hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. "He is a crippled old man. He can barely make it to the toilet by himself. He is completely at our mercy." I lay there in the dark living room, my hands balled into tight, shaking fists at my sides, my fingernails biting hard into my palms until I almost drew blood. The physical pain in my shattered leg was absolutely nothing compared to the crushing, suffocating heartbreak of hearing my own sister validate a plot to rob me blind. I was her flesh and blood. I was her older brother. I had carried her on my shoulders when she was a little girl. Yet, to her, I was just a meaningless obstacle standing between her and a massive, unearned payday. The heartbreak burned hot and agonizing for exactly 1 minute before it slowly began to calcify into something entirely different. The sadness drained away, leaving behind a cold, ruthless, and beautifully calculating resolve. They thought I was a helpless, fragile old fool waiting to be easily fleeced in my own home. They thought my broken leg made me a broken man. I would let them keep believing that exact lie right up until the precise moment I pulled the rug out from under them and destroyed their lives. There is a distinct, terrifying vulnerability in realizing the predators inside your house are no longer just exploring the shadows, but actively hunting for the weapon to end your life as you know it. My invisible war with my own family had escalated from the damp confines of the cellar all the way to the dusty rafters of the attic, and the net was drawing tighter around my throat with every passing hour. It was a quiet Sunday morning. Brenda had left the house early to attend a local brunch with some old high school acquaintances, undoubtedly eager to show off the expensive cashmere sweater she had purchased using my emergency credit card. Derek had stayed behind, claiming he needed to catch up on some remote work for a consulting gig I knew for a fact did not exist. I was lying on the living room couch, staring blankly at a muted television screen, when I heard a sound that made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a sharp, metallic squeal, followed by the heavy thud of the spring-loaded attic stairs being pulled down from the ceiling in the upstairs hallway. I had not been up in that attic in over a decade. It was a suffocating, fiberglass-filled space where I stored Mary's old winter coats, broken lamps I swore I would fix one day, and cardboard boxes filled with ancient tax documents. For a brief, naive moment, I tried to convince myself Derek was just looking for a spare blanket. But as his heavy boots stomped directly above my head, moving systematically from one side of the ceiling to the other, a sickening realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Deep inside one of those brittle cardboard boxes, buried beneath tax returns from the late 1980s, was a small, navy blue leather-bound ledger. Before I had purchased the heavy steel safe for the cellar, before I had established my secure routine, I used that little book to meticulously track my early investments. I had recorded the dates, the exact weight in ounces, the purity grades, and the purchase prices of the gold I was quietly acquiring over 30 years. It was a complete, undeniable roadmap to my hidden wealth, a detailed inventory that proved I was not a penniless old carpenter, but a man sitting on a fortune. I lay there on the couch, my broken leg throbbing in its plaster cast, entirely paralyzed as I listened to my greedy nephew rummage through the most dangerous secret I had ever misplaced. The agony of waiting was unbearable. Several hours passed before Derek finally descended, slamming the attic stairs shut. He did not come downstairs immediately. Instead, he stayed in the guest room, the floorboards creaking as he paced back and forth, vibrating with a nervous, manic energy. I knew then that he had found the blue book. I was utterly exposed. The true horror of my situation, however, did not fully materialize until that evening. Brenda had returned, smelling of expensive white wine and rich food. After a brief, whispered exchange in the hallway, she and Derek retreated to the dining room. From my position on the living room couch, I could not see them, but the open archway allowed their voices to drift freely through the quiet house. I closed my eyes, regulating my breathing to mimic a deep sleep, and strained to hear every single syllable of the treason they were plotting. I heard the distinct, heavy slap of the leather ledger hitting the solid oak dining table. "Look at the dates, Mom," Derek whispered, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of awe and absolute rage. "Look at the columns. He started buying heavy in 1992. He bought more when the market dipped in 2008. We are not talking about a few loose coins in a jar. We are talking about hundreds of ounces of solid, investment-grade bullion. It is all sitting right beneath our feet in that steel box." I heard the rustle of thick paper as Brenda flipped through the pages. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of breath, choked by the sheer magnitude of the numbers she was reading. "My God, Derek, this is a fortune. He has been sitting on this while I struggled to pay my mortgage. While you struggled to get your businesses off the ground, that selfish, arrogant old bastard. He does not deserve it," Derek spat, the venom in his tone unmistakable. "But we have a major problem. Even if we figure out how to crack that safe, we cannot just walk into a bank or a dealer with a duffel bag full of gold bars. There are taxes. There are questions. And if he notices it is missing, he can just call the police and report it stolen. We need to do this legally. We need to own everything." "How?" Brenda asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "He is stubborn. He will never sign anything over to us willingly." "He does not have to be willing," Derek replied smoothly, the sinister calculation in his voice making the hair on my arm stand straight up. "He is 68 years old. He just suffered a traumatic injury. He is on heavy narcotics. He has been acting completely isolated and depressed since Aunt Mary died. We just need to convince a judge that he is no longer mentally competent to manage his own affairs." I stopped breathing. The darkness of the living room seemed to press down on my chest, threatening to crush my ribs. They were not just planning to steal my money. They were planning to steal my freedom, my identity, and my basic human rights. "I know a lawyer in the city," Brenda said slowly, the gears turning in her head. "A guy who specializes in aggressive estate management. We file a petition for emergency conservatorship. We tell the court he is a danger to himself, that his mind is slipping, that he is living in squalor. With his broken leg, he cannot even make it to a courtroom to defend himself properly. We get medical power of attorney?" "Exactly," Derek agreed eagerly. "Once you are his legal guardian, we move him. We cannot keep him here. We put him in one of those state-run assisted living facilities, the cheap ones that take Medicaid. Once he is out of the house permanently, you have the legal right to liquidate his assets to pay for his care. We sell this old farmhouse. We hire a professional crew to drill the safe. We take control of the gold, slowly wash it through private buyers, and we are set for life." They fell silent, letting the sheer, wicked brilliance of their plan wash over them. They were going to throw me into a sterile, underfunded medical prison, a place where the elderly go to be heavily medicated and forgotten, staring at peeling wallpaper until their hearts finally give out. They were going to strip mine my home, drill my safe, and live like royalty on the sweat and blood of my entire adult life. A profound, crushing heartbreak washed over me, a sorrow so deep and dark I thought it might actually stop my heart. Brenda was my little sister, I had taught her how to ride a bicycle in the driveway of our childhood home. I had paid for her wedding dress because our parents could not afford it. Now, she was sitting in my dining room, casually plotting to erase me from the world for a pile of shiny metal. I lay alone in the dark, hot tears pricking the corners of my eyes, mourning the complete and total death of my family. But that grief only lasted for a few agonizing minutes. The sorrow burned away like morning fog under a scorching sun, leaving behind a cold, hardened core of absolute fury. They believed their plan was foolproof because it relied entirely on my weakness. They needed me to be a fragile, confused old man, incapable of fighting back against their legal machinations. They wanted a performance, and I suddenly realized that was exactly what I was going to give them. I would play the role of the declining, pathetic victim flawlessly, lulling them into a false sense of absolute security. I would let them spend their time drafting legal papers and dreaming of luxury cars, completely blind to the fact that I was already drafting a counteroffensive that would shatter their reality. The trap they were building for me was going to become the very cage that locked them away, and I knew exactly who I needed to call to help me build it. There is a dangerous kind of freedom that comes when the people you love finally prove they are your enemies. The moment I accepted that my sister and nephew were plotting to lock me away and steal my life's work, a terrifying clarity washed over my pain. I knew exactly how to dismantle their entire future, but the foundation of my revenge required me to become the exact pathetic, broken old man they desperately wanted me to be. For the next 5 days, I put on the performance of a lifetime. I stopped fighting their blatant disrespect and embraced a persona of rapid, tragic decline. When Brenda brought me a bowl of cold, unappetizing canned soup for dinner, I did not complain or ask her to heat it up. Instead, I let my hands shake violently, deliberately spilling the lukewarm, greasy broth down the front of my clean shirt. I watched from the corner of my eye as a sickening, victorious grin spread across Derek's face. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, and whispered to his mother that the dementia was finally setting in fast. I started intentionally forgetting things, allowing my voice to turn reedy and weak. I asked Brenda what day of the week it was multiple times an afternoon, staring blankly out the window as if the trees were completely alien to me. I called Derek by my late brother's name, a man who had been dead for 20 years. I let my sentences trail off into confused, frightened silence whenever they asked me a direct question. I was feeding their confirmation bias, eagerly handing them all the fabricated, tragic evidence they needed to build their aggressive legal case for my immediate mental incompetence. It worked flawlessly. They grew incredibly bold, speaking openly about nursing homes, power of attorney, and local property values right in front of me. They were absolutely convinced my brain was too riddled with age and heavy prescription painkillers to process their treachery. Brenda spent hours pacing the kitchen floor on her cellular phone, loudly discussing emergency retainer fees with her city lawyer. Derek spent his days walking through my house with a tape measure, cataloging the dimensions of the rooms, already mentally renovating my home for a quick, highly lucrative sale. They were so blinded by the dazzling light of their own impending wealth that they never once suspected the crippled man on the couch was meticulously orchestrating their absolute ruin. What they did not know was that a lifetime of extreme, isolated self-reliance breeds a certain level of healthy paranoia. Taped securely to the underside of the heavy oak coffee table, right next to where my head rested every single night, was a cheap, prepaid cellular phone. I had purchased it 5 years ago, preloaded with hundreds of minutes, specifically for absolute emergencies in case the landlines went down during a harsh winter storm. I waited until the dead of night, long after the heavy, rhythmic snores of my sister echoed from the master bedroom and Derek's restless pacing had finally ceased. I slipped my trembling hand under the table, peeled back the heavy strip of duct tape, and powered on the small, glowing screen beneath the safety of my thick wool blanket. There was only one person on this earth I trusted with my life, my secrets, and my vengeance. Thomas. We had built our custom cabinetry business together from the ground up, swinging hammers and hauling lumber side by side for over 30 years. He was a man carved from solid granite, fiercely loyal, and he despised Brenda and her entitled offspring just as much as I did. I dialed his number, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. He picked up on the third ring, his voice groggy from sleep but instantly alert the moment he heard my whispered greeting. I kept my voice to the barest, thinnest whisper, pressing the phone so tightly against my ear it physically hurt. I told him everything. I told him about the shattered leg, the hostile hostage situation in my own living room, the stolen blue ledger, and the horrifying, blood-chilling conversation I had overheard about the state-run medical prison. The silence on the other end of the line was thick and heavy, practically vibrating with Thomas's suppressed, righteous rage. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble that promised absolute destruction. He asked me exactly what we needed to do. I smiled in the darkness, a cold, predatory grimace that would have terrified my greedy family. I meticulously outlined the complex logistics of my counterstrike. We needed to entirely empty the massive steel safe in the cellar, transport the heavy gold to a highly secure private bank vault downtown, and leave behind a perfectly convincing, devastating decoy. We had to execute this massive physical transfer while keeping my vultures completely blind to the operation. It was a monumental, back-breaking task for two aging carpenters, especially with one confined to a heavy plaster cast and crutches, but our entire professional lives had been defined by solving impossible structural problems under tight, unforgiving deadlines. Thomas warned me that the timing would have to be flawless, down to the absolute second, because if Derek walked in while the vault was open, the legal trap I was setting for him would violently snap shut on my own neck instead. We would lose everything, and I would spend my final days heavily sedated in a sterile, locked ward, entirely at their mercy. I assured him the timing would be strictly under my control, dictated by the one weakness my nephew possessed in abundance. We moved on to the specific material requirements. I gave Thomas a highly detailed, extremely precise shopping list. I recited the exact dimensions of the gold bars from pure memory. They were standard poured bars, roughly 7 inches long, 3 inches wide, and nearly 2 inches thick. They weighed a staggering amount, a density that is impossible to fake with cheap materials. I instructed him to drive his heavy-duty pickup truck to a specialized masonry supply yard on the industrial edge of town. He needed to purchase high-density, commercial-grade landscaping bricks that matched those exact, rigid dimensions. The physical weight was absolutely crucial to the illusion. A hollow or light decoy would alert Derek the very moment his greedy hands touched it. The heavy, compressed concrete would provide the exact tactile feedback of a solid brick of precious metal. Then I gave him the final, most important item on the list. He needed to visit an automotive supply store and purchase 6 large cans of premium, high-gloss metallic gold spray paint, the expensive kind used to detail custom car rims. It had to be the exact, lustrous shade of heavy, rich bullion, capable of shining brightly and seductively under the harsh, focused glare of a heavy-duty flashlight in a dark basement. Thomas chuckled softly, a dry, raspy sound of pure amusement that brought the first genuine wave of comfort I had felt in weeks. He promised me he would have the unmarked transport van, the painted concrete bricks, and the private bank vault fully secured by Friday morning. We agreed he would bring the heavy-duty hand truck with the pneumatic tires, the one we used for hauling massive slabs of granite, to move the real treasure up the stairs. I ended the call and silently slipped the phone back into its hiding place beneath the table, pressing the tape firmly against the wood. The throbbing, relentless pain in my shattered leg had faded entirely into the background, completely eclipsed by the burning, righteous heat of my impending justice. The stage was beautifully set. The heavy props were being manufactured in secret. Now, all I needed to do was manipulate the extreme, blinding greed of my sister and my nephew to ensure they left the theater just long enough for me to switch the script entirely. A trap is only as good as the bait used to lure the rats out of the walls. and I knew exactly which shiny vice would make my family run blindly for the door. I needed my sister and my nephew entirely off the property for at least 48 hours to execute the massive logistical switch I had planned with Thomas. To get them out of the house, I had to play directly into their absolute, unyielding belief that I was a confused, frightened old man desperately trying to buy their continued affection. On Thursday morning, I began the charade. I let out a loud, pathetic groan from the living room couch, clutching my chest and acting as though a sudden wave of severe anxiety had washed over me. Brenda rushed into the room, not out of genuine concern for my health, but clearly terrified that I might die before she had secured the legal power of attorney she and Derek were secretly drafting. I grabbed her wrist with a trembling, weak hand, putting on a performance of a lifetime. I told her in a reedy, exhausted whisper that I was feeling incredibly guilty for being such a massive burden on them both. I told her I knew how hard they were working to care for me, and I wanted to do something special to show my deep appreciation. I directed her to the master bedroom closet, instructing her to reach into the left pocket of my heavy, dark green winter coat. A moment later, she returned to the living room clutching a thick, sealed white envelope. Inside was $2,500 in crisp, clean bills. It was a small portion of the emergency cash I kept hidden for severe weather power outages. But to Brenda, it was an irresistible jackpot. I told her there was a massive, luxury casino resort located 2 counties over, and I insisted she and Derek take the entire weekend off to relax, play the tables, and eat at the high-end steakhouses. I claimed my neighbor would come check on me, a complete lie they were all too eager to accept. The transformation in their demeanor was instantaneous and deeply sickening. The feigned exhaustion vanished from Brenda's face, replaced by a wide, hungry smile. Derek practically materialized from the kitchen, his eyes locked onto the thick stack of cash in his mother's hands. They did not hesitate. They did not ask if I would have enough food, or how I would manage to reach the bathroom on my crutches while they were gone. Within exactly 1 hour, they had packed their overnight bags and were marching out the front door, laughing together about which casino games they were going to dominate first. They drove away completely unaware that the money they were about to blow at the blackjack tables was the absolute cheapest price I could ever pay for the utter destruction of their futures. The house fell completely, beautifully silent. The moment their tail lights vanished down the long dirt driveway, my trembling weakness evaporated. I grabbed my aluminum crutches and hauled myself upright, the familiar, sharp throbbing in my shattered leg instantly masked by a massive surge of adrenaline. Exactly 15 minutes later, a heavy, unmarked white transport van pulled off the main road and backed slowly up to my rear kitchen door. Thomas stepped out of the driver's side, wearing his old canvas work jacket and a grim, determined scowl that told me he was ready for a war. He did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He immediately opened the rear doors of the van and pulled out the heavy-duty hand truck with the thick pneumatic tires, the exact one we used for decades to haul massive, crushing slabs of granite countertops. Stacked neatly in the back of the van were several heavy wooden crates, and inside those crates was the beautiful, deceptive counterfeit wealth that would seal my family's fate. I guided Thomas through the kitchen and unlocked the heavy door leading down to the cellar. He descended the wooden stairs, his heavy work boots thudding softly in the cool, damp air. I followed slowly behind him, carefully navigating the steps with my crutches, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. When we reached the back right corner of the basement, I instructed him to pry up the false floorboard. He slid a flathead screwdriver into the hidden seam, lifting the aged pine board to reveal the massive, fireproof steel safe bolted directly into the thick concrete foundation. I gave him the combination from memory. He spun the heavy steel dial, and with a satisfying, deep click, the heavy door swung open. The dull, magnificent gleam of pure, solid gold illuminated the dark space. It was the physical manifestation of my entire adult life. 35 years of back-breaking labor, extreme frugality, and relentless saving. Thomas let out a low, respectful whistle. shaking his head in sheer disbelief before he immediately got to work. Because of my broken leg, I could only sit on a sturdy wooden crate and supervise, which frustrated my pride to no end. But Thomas worked with the mechanical, relentless efficiency of a man half his age. He carefully loaded the heavy, solid gold bars onto the hand truck, stacking them securely before wheeling them over to the stairs. Moving that kind of dense, concentrated weight up a flight of wooden basement stairs is agonizing, brutal work. It took us over 3 grueling hours and dozens of painstakingly slow trips to completely empty the safe and secure the real treasure inside the reinforced steel lockboxes bolted to the floor of his transport van. Once my life savings were safely secured in the vehicle, the second phase of the operation began. Thomas began wheeling the heavy wooden crates down from the van into the cellar. When he cracked open the first crate, a faint, chemical smell of aerosol paint wafted into the musty basement air. Inside were the heavy, commercial-grade landscaping bricks he had purchased from the masonry yard. He had meticulously coated every single square inch of the dense concrete with a high-gloss, premium metallic gold spray paint. Under the dim, yellowish glow of the basement work lights, the illusion was absolutely breathtaking. The painted bricks perfectly matched the exact visual footprint of standard poured bullion. But more importantly, the extreme density of the compressed concrete provided the precise, heavy tactile feedback required to fool a greedy, rushing thief. If Derek managed to break into the safe, he would not be met with hollow plastic or lightweight wood. He would find rows and rows of heavy, gleaming blocks that felt exactly like the fortune he believed he was stealing. Thomas carefully arranged the painted bricks inside the heavy steel safe, stacking them in the exact same configuration as my original hoard. When the final painted brick was set into place, the safe looked identical to the way it had appeared 3 hours prior. The trap was perfectly armed. Thomas closed the heavy steel door, spun the dial to lock the thick internal bolts, and carefully replaced the false pine floorboard, sweeping a thin layer of natural basement dust over the seams to hide any evidence of our tampering. We returned to the kitchen, exhausted and dripping with sweat. Thomas washed his hands in the sink, turning to me with a fierce, loyal gleam in his eye. He promised me he would drive the unmarked van straight to the highly guarded private bank vault downtown, a secure facility where I had already rented a massive deposit box under a newly formed corporate entity that Brenda and Derek could never trace. I shook his hand, feeling a profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude for the only man in the world who had never once betrayed my trust. He left quietly through the back door, the heavy engine of the van fading into the distance. I was alone again in the silent farmhouse, but the atmosphere had entirely shifted. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in my own home. I was the architect of a spectacular downfall. The physical weight was gone from my cellar, safely locked behind 20 inches of reinforced concrete miles away. But the psychological trap was now fully set to spring, leaving just one final, irresistible piece of bait for my nephew to inevitably find. There is a unique, suffocating silence that fills a house right before a storm breaks. A heavy anticipation where every creaking floorboard sounds like a ticking clock counting down to total ruin. When Brenda and Derek finally returned from their weekend at the luxury casino resort late Sunday evening, the stench of stale cigarette smoke and cheap casino liquor rolled in with them. They were practically glowing with an unearned, arrogant satisfaction. Brenda carried 2 large shopping bags from high-end boutiques, while Derek swaggered through the front door like a conquering king returning to his newly acquired castle. They laughed loudly in the kitchen, casually tossing my expensive emergency credit card onto the counter as if it were a piece of trash. They thought they had successfully played the pathetic, broken old man for a fool. They believed their absolute victory was imminent, completely oblivious to the fact that they were currently standing exactly 10 feet above a carefully arranged pile of painted landscaping bricks. I remained on the living room couch, maintaining my facade of frail exhaustion. I offered a weak, trembling smile as Brenda briefly peeked her head around the archway to check if I was still breathing. She did not ask if I had eaten over the past 48 hours. nor did she inquire about the agonizing pain in my shattered leg. She simply smirked, told me the buffet was adequate, and immediately retreated to the master bedroom to admire her new clothes. Derek did not even bother to look in my direction. He went straight to the kitchen to pour himself a tall glass of my premium bourbon, his mind undoubtedly racing with fantasies of the solid gold fortune he intended to violently extract from my foundation. He was already planning his lavish future, entirely unaware that the specific methods he was about to employ would guarantee his total destruction. The next morning, the final phase of my meticulously designed operation commenced. I needed to provide Derek with a completely empty house and an irresistible window of opportunity. I waited until Brenda came into the kitchen to brew her morning coffee before I carefully sprang the trap. I hauled myself up onto my aluminum crutches, leaning heavily against the doorframe, and put on a mask of deep, confused anxiety. I told her the phone had rung early that morning while she was still asleep. I claimed it was a very aggressive clerk from a medical evaluation board across town, specifically referencing the aggressive estate lawyer she had been secretly consulting. I told her the lawyer had filed an urgent motion requiring me to undergo a comprehensive, all-day neurological and physical evaluation to determine my absolute competency to live independently. I let my voice crack, feigning pure terror at the prospect of being forced into a state-run facility. I told her the appointment would take a minimum of 8 hours, and that my old business partner, Thomas, was already on his way to pick me up because I was too terrified to drive or take a cab. The sheer, blinding flash of triumph that crossed Brenda's face was almost comical. She genuinely believed her secret legal machinations were working flawlessly and moving faster than she ever anticipated. She immediately shifted into a tone of false, sickening sympathy, assuring me it was just a routine procedure and that everything would be perfectly fine. She promised she would stay behind to clean the house and keep an eye on things. But I knew the moment my truck pulled out of the driveway, she would be on the phone with her lawyer, celebrating her imminent legal control over my entire life. Thomas arrived exactly on schedule, pulling his heavy, rumbling pickup truck into the driveway. But before I hobbled out the front door to meet him, I had 2 crucial, deeply critical tasks left to complete while Brenda was entirely distracted in the upstairs bathroom. First, I swung my way quietly down the hall to my private office. I approached my heavy oak desk, the one Derek had already tried to forcefully pry open with a flathead screwdriver. I unlocked the top right drawer, sliding it open just a fraction of an inch to make it an irresistible target. Inside, resting perfectly atop a stack of mundane utility bills, I placed a bright yellow Post-it note. Written on the paper in my own messy, hurried handwriting was a fake 6-digit combination. I knew Derek's profound greed would compel him to search my office the absolute second he realized he had the house to himself. I knew he would find the note, and I knew the failure of those specific numbers would drive him to take extreme, irreversible measures. My second task required a brief, agonizing trip to the cellar. I slipped through the kitchen while Brenda was running the shower upstairs. I carefully descended the wooden stairs, the dull throbbing in my broken leg a constant reminder of my vulnerability. Hidden inside my thick winter coat were 2 high-definition, motion-activated security cameras. Thomas had purchased them with cash over the weekend, ensuring they were completely untraceable and linked directly to a secure tablet he held in his truck. I moved with quiet, desperate urgency. I mounted the first camera high up on a wooden support beam, entirely concealed behind a stack of dusty, forgotten cardboard boxes. I angled the lens perfectly downward, capturing a wide, unobstructed view of the false pine floorboard and the heavy steel safe beneath it. I mounted the second camera on the opposite wall, tucked discreetly behind an old, rusted metal shelving unit. This camera was positioned to capture a clear, high-resolution shot of the intruder's face the moment they breached the safe door. I activated both devices, waiting for the tiny green indicator lights to blink twice, confirming they were actively recording and broadcasting a live feed. The trap was fully armed, baited, and placed under strict, unblinking surveillance. I carefully made my way back up the stairs, locking the cellar door behind me. I grabbed my coat and my crutches, making plenty of noise as I shuffled toward the front entryway. Brenda emerged from the stairwell, wrapping a plush robe around herself, offering me a final, sickly sweet wave goodbye. Derek was nowhere to be seen, likely pretending to sleep while actually listening intently to my departure. I climbed into the passenger seat of Thomas's truck, letting out a long, shuddering breath as I closed the heavy door. Thomas did not say a word. He simply shifted the truck into gear and drove slowly down the long dirt driveway. I watched my old, beautiful farmhouse shrink in the side mirror, a place that had once been my absolute sanctuary, now completely transformed into a high-stakes snare. We did not drive toward the hospital across town. Instead, Thomas navigated the winding back roads until we reached his own modest, secluded property about 15 miles away. He helped me inside, settling me comfortably into a deep leather recliner in his quiet living room. He walked over to his kitchen counter, retrieved a sleek, black digital tablet, and handed it to me without a single word. I rested the tablet on my lap, my hands trembling slightly with a mixture of raw adrenaline and cold, calculating anticipation. I tapped the screen, opening the secure application Thomas had installed. Instantly, the dark, familiar corners of my own cellar illuminated the glass. The high-definition feed was crystal clear, capturing every single speck of dust dancing in the dim light. I stared at the false floorboard, feeling the heavy, rhythmic pounding of my own heart against my ribs. The bait was set. The house was empty. Now, all I had to do was sit back in absolute comfort and wait for the rat to blindly trigger the guillotine. There is a specific kind of breathless, paralyzing anticipation that grips your heart when you are finally watching your own flesh and blood walk directly into the snare you built for them. Sitting in the quiet safety of Thomas's living room, anchored to a comfortable leather recliner, I stared at the glowing tablet resting on my lap. For the first hour, the high-definition feed of my cellar was perfectly still, an eerie, undisturbed portrait of the damp concrete walls and forgotten cardboard boxes. Thomas sat at the kitchen island behind me, nursing a cup of black coffee, the heavy silence between us vibrating with a shared, righteous tension. We were two old carpenters waiting for the ultimate structural collapse of a completely rotten foundation. It happened exactly at 10:30 in the morning. The heavy wooden door at the top of the cellar stairs suddenly swung open, casting a long, sharp slice of kitchen light down into the gloom. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as the shadow shifted, solidifying into the unmistakable silhouette of my 32-year-old nephew. Derek descended the stairs with a hurried, heavy confidence, totally unconcerned with making noise. He believed the house was entirely his kingdom now, an empty playground where he was completely free to execute his master plan. He was not carrying a laundry basket or a box of seasonal decorations. Slung over his right shoulder was a massive, heavy-duty canvas duffel bag, the thick strap straining under the weight of whatever he had brought to wage war on my property. He reached the bottom of the stairs and flicked on the harsh overhead work lights. The dual cameras I had meticulously hidden in the rafters captured every single detail in pristine clarity. I could see the feverish, manic gleam in his eyes. I could see the arrogant smirk playing on his lips. I watched his face contort into a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement, completely unaware that his violent greed was the exact catalyst I was counting on to seal his fate permanently. Derek walked straight to the back right corner of the basement, his boots thudding against the concrete. He did not even hesitate before dropping to his knees and prying up the false pine floorboard with his bare hands. He tossed the wood aside with total disregard for the craftsmanship it had taken me to build it. There, resting securely in the foundation, was the heavy steel combination safe. He unzipped the canvas duffel bag and began pulling out his tools. First came a heavy, bright orange industrial extension cord. Next, he produced a massive iron crowbar, the kind used for demolishing reinforced drywall. Finally, he hauled out the main weapon, a heavy-duty, professional-grade angle grinder equipped with a thick diamond-tipped cutting wheel. This was not a casual snooping expedition. This was a premeditated, highly destructive felony, and he was committing it with the absolute certainty that he would never face a single consequence. Before he plugged the machine into the wall, he reached into the front pocket of his expensive denim jeans. My breath caught in my throat as he pulled out a crumpled, bright yellow square of paper. It was the post-it note I had deliberately left in the top drawer of my desk. He flattened the paper against his thigh, his eyes darting between my fake, messy handwriting and the heavy steel dial of the safe. He reached out with trembling hands and began to spin the lock. He entered the 6-digit code slowly, deliberately, his entire body tense with the expectation of unimaginable wealth. He turned the handle. It did not budge. The heavy internal locking bolts remained firmly set. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He looked closely at the yellow note again, muttered something under his breath, and spun the dial a second time. Applying more pressure, again, the handle refused to yield. By the third failed attempt, the thin veneer of his arrogant confidence shattered completely. Derek slammed his closed fist violently against the top of the safe, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. He crumpled the yellow post-it note into a tiny ball and threw it furiously across the cellar floor. He had truly believed I was careless enough to leave the keys to the kingdom sitting in a desk drawer. Now, faced with a solid wall of thick steel, his frustration boiled over into a destructive, blind rage. He grabbed the extension cord, plugged it into the overhead outlet, and snatched up the heavy angle grinder. When he squeezed the trigger, the violent, high-pitched scream of the motor echoed even through the silent tablet screen. He brought the spinning diamond blade down hard against the top hinge of the safe. A massive, brilliant shower of bright orange sparks erupted into the dim basement, illuminating the walls like a fountain of fire. The high-definition camera captured the sheer, aggressive violence of his assault. He was leaning his entire body weight into the machine, his face twisted into a snarl of sheer exertion and unbridled greed. He was cutting through a 1/4 inch of hardened steel, destroying my property, actively attempting to steal my life savings, and he was doing it with a terrifyingly clear conscience. It took him nearly 20 agonizing minutes to slice through the heavy top hinge. Sweat poured down his forehead, soaking the collar of his shirt. He did not pause to rest. He immediately repositioned his body and attacked the bottom hinge, the shower of sparks continuing to rain down onto the concrete floor. Sitting in the recliner, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace wash over me. I was not watching a tragedy unfold. I was watching a beautifully orchestrated demolition. Every single spark that flew from that grinder was another nail he was driving into his own coffin. Finally, the bottom hinge gave way with a sickening, metallic snap. Derek dropped the angle grinder, the blade still spinning down, and grabbed the heavy iron crowbar. He jammed the wedge tip into the damaged seam of the door and threw his entire body weight backward. The thick steel groaned, a loud, agonizing sound of tortured metal, before the heavy door violently popped open, crashing heavily onto the concrete floor. The vault was completely breached. Inside, perfectly illuminated by the harsh overhead lights, sat rows and rows of gleaming, heavy golden bars. Derek dropped the crowbar. It clattered loudly against the floor. He fell to his knees, his hands hovering over the open safe, his entire body trembling violently with the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his perceived victory. He was panting heavily, staring at the painted concrete as if he had just discovered the meaning of life. The moment his greedy fingers reached into the box to touch the first brick, I picked up my cellular phone and dialed 911. The operator answered on the first ring, her voice calm and professional. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the tablet screen, my voice steady, urgent, and perfectly clear. I told her my name and my exact home address. I told her I was a disabled, 68-year-old man currently staying with a friend across town, and that I was watching a live security feed of my property. I reported that a man had just violently broken into my basement, used heavy power tools to destroy a massive floor safe, and was currently attempting to steal everything inside it. I emphasized that the intruder was armed with an iron crowbar and a heavy industrial grinder, ensuring the police response would be massive, swift, and highly aggressive. The dispatcher promised multiple cruisers were already en route and would arrive in less than 4 minutes, giving me just enough time to witness the exact, glorious moment my nephew's grandest illusion shattered into a million worthless pieces. On the screen, Derek finally wrapped his hands around one of the golden blocks. He hauled it out of the safe, grunting slightly at the impressive, commercial-grade weight. He held it up toward the light, a massive, victorious smile spreading across his sweaty face. But as he wiped his thumb across the surface of the brick, trying to clear away a smudge of basement dust, his smile faltered. The high-definition camera zoomed in just enough for me to see the exact moment the premium metallic spray paint flaked away beneath his heavy thumb. A jagged streak of dull, rough gray concrete was instantly exposed. Derek froze entirely, his brow furrowed in deep, utter confusion. He violently scratched at the brick with his fingernails, scraping away large, golden flakes of paint that drifted down onto his lap like cheap glitter. The magnificent, heavy bullion he thought would finance his entire future was nothing more than compressed dirt and cheap chemicals. He dropped the heavy brick. It hit the concrete floor with a dull, sickening thud, cracking cleanly in half. He frantically reached into the safe, grabbing another brick, then another, scratching at them with a desperate, manic terror. Gray concrete. Gray concrete. Nothing but gray concrete. His victorious swagger evaporated, replaced entirely by a hollow, gaping expression of absolute horror. He finally realized he had just spent the last hour committing a highly destructive, undeniable felony on high-definition camera, completely destroying my property, all for a pile of painted landscaping rocks. He sat back on his heels, his chest heaving, staring at the shattered concrete with wide, panicked eyes. He had absolutely no idea how this was possible. But the wail of approaching sirens bleeding through the silent video feed was about to offer him a very harsh, very permanent education in the reality of consequences. There is no sound quite as sweet as the wail of a police siren when you know exactly who it is coming for. The grand finale of my nephew's pathetic, greedy play was about to commence, and he was the only one in the room who did not know his lines. As I sat in the safety of Thomas's living room, watching the live security feed, one final question lingered in the back of my mind. What would Brenda do when she finally realized the fortune was entirely fake? And would her own blinding entitlement seal her doom alongside her son? Through the high-definition tablet screen, the distant, faint wail of the sirens quickly escalated into a deafening, terrifying roar. Derek snapped his head toward the small, dirty basement window. The flashing red and blue lights cut fiercely through the gloom, painting his horrified face in a frantic, terrifying strobe light. He dropped the broken piece of concrete. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, perfectly echoing the sudden, crushing reality of his situation. Panic, raw and completely unadulterated, washed over him. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping wildly on the layer of thick concrete dust he had just created. He frantically tried to gather his heavy tools, shoving the angle grinder and the iron crowbar back into the canvas duffel bag. But he was completely out of time. The heavy footfalls of multiple police officers echoed violently through the kitchen above. Bright flashlights pierced the darkness at the top of the wooden stairs. Deep, authoritative voices boomed, commanding anyone in the basement to immediately show their hands. Derek froze like a terrified animal caught in a trap. His hands shot up into the air, trembling violently. He was covered from head to toe in gray concrete dust and shiny, cheap gold paint flakes. The officers descended the stairs rapidly, their weapons drawn and leveled directly at his chest. They were completely unimpressed by his sudden, stuttering attempts to explain himself. I watched with deep, soul-nourishing vindication as they forcefully spun him around and pushed him hard against the cold, damp foundation wall. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Derek kept babbling wildly. He told the officers it was his uncle's house, that he was allowed to be there, and that the safe was filled with his family's gold. The lead officer simply shined his bright flashlight onto the destroyed safe door, the scattered burglary tools, and the broken painted landscaping bricks resting uselessly on the floor. He read Derek his Miranda rights in a bored, flat tone, completely ignoring the desperate, pathetic whimpers of a man who suddenly realized his life was over. They marched him forcefully up the wooden stairs, his expensive denim jeans ruined by the dust of his own massive failure. I turned the tablet screen off and handed it back to Thomas. A slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. He helped me out of the deep leather recliner, and we drove slowly back to my farmhouse to formally meet with the investigating detectives. When we pulled into the long dirt driveway, my property was surrounded by 4 flashing police cruisers. I gave my official statement to a very polite, stern-faced sergeant standing on my front porch. I handed over the digital copies of the high-definition security footage, providing absolute, undeniable proof of the violent break-in and the malicious destruction of my property. Just as I was finishing my statement, a massive, unexpected twist of fate arrived. Brenda's car came screeching violently to a halt on the front grass, entirely missing the paved driveway. She burst out of the driver's side door, practically tripping over her own feet. She had clearly received a panicked, desperate phone call from her son from the back of the police cruiser. She was still wearing her expensive new cashmere sweater, carrying shopping bags from high-end boutiques, looking completely absurd, illuminated by the flashing emergency lights. Instead of playing the role of the shocked, innocent bystander, her blinding, toxic greed completely overrode her basic survival instincts. She marched aggressively right up to the sergeant, pointing a trembling, manic finger directly at my face. She screamed at the top of her lungs that the police had to release Derek immediately. She loudly declared that I was a crazy, senile old miser hoarding a massive, untaxed fortune in solid gold in the basement. She told the officers they had absolutely no right to arrest her son, because they were already in the active legal process of having me forcefully committed to a state-run mental facility. She yelled that the gold was rightfully theirs to manage my estate and pay for my forced care. The police officers stared at her in utter, stunned disbelief. The sergeant slowly pulled out his notepad, his expression hardening into pure ice. He calmly informed Brenda that there was absolutely no gold in the basement. He told her they found nothing but a pile of cheap, painted landscaping bricks, and that her son was currently sitting in the back of a squad car facing multiple severe felony charges for destroying a heavy steel safe. Brenda's face drained of all color, turning a sickening shade of pale gray. Her jaw dropped open in silent horror, but the sergeant was not finished. He informed her that by loudly and publicly confessing to a premeditated conspiracy to declare me medically incompetent, specifically to gain forced access to my hidden financial assets, she had just handed the police all the probable cause they needed to arrest her as a direct accomplice to elder fraud and attempted grand larceny. The arrogant, untouchable attitude she had carried for 50 years shattered into a million irreversible pieces. She began to hyperventilate, begging and pleading as a female officer stepped forward and placed her in handcuffs right there on my front lawn. I stood on my porch, leaning heavily on my aluminum crutches, and watched them both get driven away into the dark night. The fallout was breathtakingly swift and completely absolute. Derek was formally charged with felony destruction of property, breaking and entering, and attempted burglary. Brenda faced severe, life-ruining legal repercussions for her vocal involvement in the conspiracy against a disabled relative. I immediately filed permanent, ironclad restraining orders against both of them. Their grand, evil plan to lock me away in a sterile medical prison vanished instantly, replaced by their own very real, very inescapable legal nightmares. They became the ultimate cautionary tale in our extended family, disgraced, ruined, and completely shunned by everyone who learned the terrifying truth of what they tried to do to me. As for me, the months passed quietly. My broken leg eventually healed perfectly. The heavy plaster cast was removed, and I returned to my peaceful, solitary routine. My beautiful farmhouse remains my absolute sanctuary. My true legacy, the heavy, solid gold bars I spent my entire life accumulating, sits perfectly secure behind 20 inches of reinforced steel in a private bank vault downtown, completely untouchable by greedy hands. I still enjoy my simple, frugal life, tending to my backyard vegetable garden and watching the golden sun set from my front porch. I beat my vicious family at their own wicked game, and the profound, beautiful peace that comes with that victory is worth infinitely more than all the gold in the entire world. Thank you so much for watching my story. If you enjoyed this satisfying conclusion, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Leave a comment down below with the word karma so I know you made it all the way to the end. And do not forget to hit the hype button so this video can reach more viewers who appreciate a good, well-deserved dose of justice.